CB1, receptors and the interactions of cannabinoids and terpenes. This content is for educational purposes only. No medical advice is being given. Always follow your local laws and regulations regarding cannabis. CB1 receptors are the center of gravity for how cannabis shapes human experience, but a surface explanation rarely does justice to what's actually happening. If you've already covered the usual basics, CB1 is mostly in the brain, THC binds CB1, terpenes influence the feel. Set those aside. This video is the deeper layer budtenders and educators can use when the conversation moves beyond a percentage on a label. The goal is to give you a working language that is specific, compliant, and usable on camera without drifting into medical claims or introductory repetition. What matters most at this level isn't listing where CB1 exists, it's understanding how CB1 behaves. CB1 is a G-protein coupled receptor embedded in neuronal membranes, but its behavior is not uniform. It changes with the ligand that meets it, the lipid environment surrounding it, the cell type hosting it, the recent signaling history, and the route and formulation by which the ligand arrived. That is why two products with the same THC milligrams can feel different in tempo, contour, and emotional texture. Begin with the idea of efficacy rather than occupancy. Receptor occupancy is a head count, how much of CB1 is taken up by a ligand at a given concentration. Efficacy is the quality of that engagement, what the receptor actually does inside the cell once the ligand sits down. D9. THC is a partial agonist at CB1, which means the receptor can be activated without being driven to its theoretical maximum. A different ligand with the same occupancy can push CB1 into a slightly different microshape and bias downstream pathways differently. For working educators, that one concept, efficacy over occupancy, explains why numbers on a certificate of analysis, though important, never capture the full story. Inside the neuron, CB1 commonly couples to GO proteins. This coupling reduces cyclic AMP and modulates ion channels that govern neurotransmitter release. But the nuance lives in where CB1 sits in the synapse and which channels it controls in that location. On many excitatory terminals, CB1 reduces presynaptic calcium influx through N-type and PQ-type calcium channels. On many inhibitory terminals, it can also facilitate potassium conductances that quiet the terminal. That microplacement yields macro effects. When CB1 attenuates excitatory release in one network while toning down inhibitory release in another, the forward flow of information changes in a way that people experience as shifts in time sense, novelty salience, humor threshold, and body awareness. None of this requires promises about outcomes. It's simply the circuitry a consumer is riding when a product lands. The receptor does not live in a vacuum. CB1 resides within lipid microdomains, cholesterol-rich rafts, and dynamic regions of the membrane that change fluidity with temperature, diet, and the cocktail of small lipophiles arriving alongside cannabinoids. That environment affects how efficiently CB1 couples to its intracellular partners. Monoterpenes and sesquiterpenes are small and oily enough to partition into membranes and nudge the local fluidity. This can subtly change how quickly CB1 shifts between active and inactive conformations. The practical translation for retail is that terpene-rich products can feel more snappy or more soft-edged, not because the terpenes are turning CB1 on directly, but because the membrane and signaling context around CB1 has been changed by the overall blend. Ligand diversity magnifies this. D9, THC is the workhorse, but it isn't the only passenger meeting CB1. D9, THCP, present in trace amounts in some plants and more commonly discussed in concentrates, shows higher affinity at CB1 in vitro. A molecule with greater affinity can occupy the receptor at lower concentrations, and if its efficacy profile favors a particular signaling branch, the downstream feel can skew even when the milligram count looks modest. THCV behaves in a dose-dependent manner. Low exposure can antagonize CB1, occupying the pocket without driving the signal, while higher exposure can cross into partial agonism. That flip explains why small amounts of THCV in a mixed product may lend crispness to the first minutes of the session, while larger amounts can act more like a participatory driver. CBN binds CB1 weakly compared to THC. Its well-known value comes not from commanding CB1 alone, but from riding shotgun in a THC-led context, shaping the length and heaviness of the arc. CBG's low-affinity interactions at CB1 still matter in mixtures. Even modest engagement can shift the bias of signaling when several ligands share the same receptor neighborhood at once. Allosteric modulation is the second lever. Not every molecule that changes CB1's behavior occupies the main pocket. Some sit elsewhere on the receptor and change the way the orthosteric seat behaves. CBD is the most discussed negative allosteric modulator at CB1 in human-relevant conversations. It does not compete with THC at the main site. It nudges CB1 from the side and can blunt the amplitude of CB1 activation by orthosteric agonists. Pregnenolone, an endogenous steroid, is another negative allosteric modulator that can limit CB1 signaling amplitude when present at sufficient levels. In practice, allosteric modulation acts like a governor on the receptor's range of motion. For blended products, that means two jars with the same THC percentage can diverge radically depending on the presence and concentration of allosteric nudgers. There is also CB1 that does not sit on the usual synaptic membrane. A population of CB1 exists on mitochondria inside neurons, often called MTCB1. When CB1 signal flows from mitochondrial membranes, it can dial down elements of cellular respiration, changing ATP availability and the timing of energy-hungry tasks in neurons. Consumers won't talk about mitochondrial complex 1, but they do notice when an experience feels buoyant and kinetic versus slow and immersive. Part of that difference, in blends that favor mitochondrial engagement, may be attributable to MTCB1 dynamics. It's still CB1, but with a different address and a different lever arm on the cell's power budget. A parallel story plays out in astrocytes, the star-shaped glial cells that envelop synapses and set the chemical weather around them. Astrocytes form a tripartite synapse with pre- and postsynaptic neurons, and astrocytic CB1 can shape gliotransmitter release that feeds back on the synapse. When astrocytic CB1 changes extracellular glutamate, or ATP tone, the sense of immersion, echo, or space in music and conversation can change. Consumers often describe that as a widening of soundstage or depth of field during intoxication, and while many factors contribute, astrocytic CB1 is a plausible bridge between receptor pharmacology and subjective description without invoking therapeutic claims. CB1's responsiveness changes with recent history. G-protein-coupled receptors desensitize when hammered. Kinases like GRKs can phosphorylate CB1's intracellular loops during sustained stimulation, recruiting B-arrestins that uncouple CB1 from its G-protein and trigger endocytosis. Internalized receptors leave the surface, spend time in endosomes, and can either recycle or degrade. The surface expression drops, so the same amount of THC the next day produces a smaller effect. That is tolerance at the membrane and trafficking level. The reverse is also true. With reduced stimulation, CB1 surface numbers and coupling efficiency can recover. This is why the same product can feel inconsistent across weeks for the same person, even if nothing in the jar changed. The receptor is a living object in a living membrane with its own schedule of wear and repair. Biased agonism adds another dimension. CB1 can signal through G proteins or through B-arrestin-mediated routes, and ligands can tilt the receptor toward one branch. Two partial agonists may both work, but one can bias toward G-protein signaling, favoring ion channel modulation and fast synaptic effects, while another leans toward B-arrestin scaffolding, favoring slower kinase cascades, gene expression changes, and plasticity. In human terms, one product may come on with quick, clean edges and fade predictably, while another feels sticky around the edges and lingers in mood and attention beyond the obvious peak. Both experiences point to CB1. They differ in which downstream route is emphasized by the blend of ligands occupying and influencing the receptor. Human variability is not noise. It's the other half of the equation. The CNR1 gene encodes CB1, and common polymorphisms can shape expression levels or receptor behavior. Beyond genetics, epigenetic marks and developmental history alter receptor density by region. Diet influences the membrane lipid mix in which CB1 lives. Omega-3 status, for example, shapes endocannabinoid tone and membrane properties. Sleep debt, stress, and recent exposure to cannabis all change the background state into which a new dose arrives. Two customers can buy the same product and bring it to two different receptor landscapes. Neither is wrong for reporting a different experience. Delivery temperature creates its own kind of bias even before receptor engagement. Volatilization profiles differ across terpenes and cannabinoids. Lower initial temperatures favor more volatile monoterpenes, while ramping up draws in the heavier sesquiterpenes and, eventually, thermally robust cannabinoids. A session that begins at a lower temperature and steps upward front-loads aroma and the phase-setting influence of terpenes before fully driving cannabinoid vapor. That ordering matters because CB1 sits downstream of sensory input. When the brain is primed by a terpene-rich first inhale, the same CB1 activation that follows can be perceived through a different affective filter. Products designed for step temperature release, or devices that ramp in stages, create a reproducible contour many consumers report as smoother and more articulate than one-temperature sessions. Formulation science changes CB1's time course without changing the receptor itself. Emulsification and carrier selection alter how quickly and through which portal cannabinoids enter circulation. Nanoemulsions with small droplet sizes present a large surface area to digestive enzymes and can shorten time to noticeable effects. Carriers like MCT oil favor rapid absorption and hepatically mediated appearance of 11-hydroxy metabolites. Carriers biased toward long-chain triglycerides can tilt a portion of delivery into lymphatic pathways, altering first-pass metabolism. Lecithin and other phospholipids can increase micellar solubilization and consistency, reducing the chaos between fed and fasted states. None of these change what CB1 is. They change when and how ligands arrive, which decides whether CB1 is pushed in a quick, high-contrast spike or a long, rolling wave. A bud tender who understands that choreography can explain, without making promises, why two edibles with the same dose feel different. Minor cannabinoids that ride along with THC often function as quiet editors of CB1's sentence structure. CBC has modest direct engagement at CB1, yet shows signal in pathways that crosstalk with CB1's outputs, which can sharpen or soften the contour of the experience depending on proportions. Cannabidivarin, CBDV, is frequently discussed for its modulation of channels that participate in neuronal excitability. In blends, that can change the texture of CB1-driven perception. Cannabicromevarin, CBCV, and other varins appear in trace quantities but can assert influence out of proportion to their milligrams when the total terpene load is high and the membrane context is primed. The practical message is not that any one minor cannabinoid does X, but that small amounts, when combined with a terpene-rich environment, can tilt how CB1 reads the room in real time. Because terpenes are not a monolith, it's useful to talk beyond the most familiar names. Terpinolene often leads with a sweet, camphor-tinged brightness and is common in profiles people describe as airy or mentally wandering. Ocimene leans green and slightly tropical. In blends where ocimene is prominent, consumers often report a buoyant first phase before the session settles. Nerolidol, a sesquiterpene with a woody tea-like presence, shows up in products people describe as deep and steady, and its physical properties favor persistence later into a session when monoterpenes have dissipated. Bisabolol, with its soft floral profile, can round harsh edges, functioning as a sensory softener for the way CB1 activity is read by attention networks. Eucalyptol, 1,8-cineol, though often present in small amounts, carries crispness that some consumers describe as clearing. As a relatively volatile ether, it can front-load a perception of freshness before the heavier parts of the mix engage CB1 in force. None of these terpenes are CB1 switches. They are environmental lighting, the color temperature of the room in which CB1 does its work. There is a second, quieter route by which terpenes may affect CB1's downstream influence. Receptor crosstalk. Several terpenes interact with TRP channels, temperature and irritant sensing channels, and other GPCRs. When those channels shift the excitability of the same terminals that CB1 is trying to calm, the combined effect is not linear. A terpene that warms TRPV channels can make the first minutes of a session feel more expansive. CB1 then reins in presynaptic release against a background that is already moving in a particular direction. The user attributes the ensemble to that strain, but underneath, the tuning is a conversation among receptors that share membrane space. Receptor reserve is a practical idea that rarely makes it into retail conversation, but explains a lot of customer variance. In some circuits, there is a surplus of CB1 relative to the amount needed to produce a maximal effect. In others, CB1 expression is closer to the minimal number required. A person with a generous reserve can see large effects from modest occupancy because the extra receptors amplify signal easily. A person with lean reserve needs higher occupancy to see the same change. Reserve is dynamic. Heavy recent exposure can trim it by pulling receptors off the surface. Lighter exposure can grow it back. This is why friends can split the same joint and one feels launched, while the other reports a gentle nudge despite similar body size and tolerance histories. The metabolic side of the story is equally important for CB1's timeline. While it's well understood that first-pass metabolism yields 11-hydroxy-THC from oral products, the surrounding mixture matters. Certain emulsifiers speed gastric emptying, others slow it. Co-ingested fats change bile release and micelle formation, altering the fraction of cannabinoids that ride lymphatic routes and delay liver exposure. Terpene co-loads can act as penetration enhancers in the gut in small, transient ways. The same labeled dose can therefore present as a quick, high CB1 push or as a drawn-out plateau, depending on the matrix, feeding state, and individual physiology. Educators can speak to this confidently without inching toward advice. The matrix decides the music of the dose. It's useful to ground all this in the way people actually talk about cannabis. Consumers rarely say biased agonism or astrocyte-mediated gliotransmission. They say a product was clean, muddy, floaty, present, or too sticky in the head. Those adjectives can be translated back to receptor behavior. Clean often reflects a profile that front-loads monoterpenes at lower temperatures, carries modest B-arrestin recruitment, and avoids heavy late-stage sesquiterpenes. Muddy often tracks with dense, late-releasing sesquiterpenes and a blend that biases CB1 signaling toward prolonged kinase cascades. Floaty shows up when mitochondrial engagement and network-level desynchronization are pronounced. Present often shows up when pinene-like crispness and varin cannabinoids put gentle brakes on runaway CB1 activity at the front end. Sticky in the head often appears when the blend keeps CB1 engaged after the sensory phase has faded, which can reflect slower clearance, high membrane partitioning, or biased routing toward pathways that linger. What a bud tender can do with this is not promise outcomes, but frame expectations and teach better shopping. Look for COAs that report total terpene content, rather than listing a single exotic terpene as a marketing hook. When totals are meaningfully above 1%, the membrane context is likely to be more influential. When varin cannabinoids appear, THCV, CBDV, note their low-dose antagonism tendencies at CB1 and set expectations for a tighter, brisker opening. When a product lists a significant neurolidal or bisabolol presence, prepare the customer for a later phase soft landing rather than an early spike. When a consumer reports inconsistent experiences with edibles, draw attention to carrier oils and emulsifiers on the label. The CB1 story is downstream of how the dose is built. Consistency can be improved by controlling what is controllable in delivery. Vapor sessions benefit from intentional temperature profiles. Starting low to explore aroma and then stepping up reduces the shock of CB1 engagement while preserving the product's character. Oral products benefit from consistent context. Taking them with similar meals or at similar times reduces noise. None of this tells a customer what they will feel. It explains why the same product can feel wildly different on different days and offers non-medical levers for making the experience repeatable. Finally, consider how this deeper CB1 understanding changes the way you talk about THC percentage. THC percent is a measure of payload, not of journey. A product with moderate THC, but a terpene profile that primes membranes, biases CB1 toward fast G protein routes, and avoids over-recruiting B-arrestin, can feel more articulate and potent than a high THC product delivered in a flat matrix that slams CB1 hard and desensitizes it early. The person who chases the highest number may get the least nuanced experience. The person who reads the whole panel, cannabinoids, terpene totals, carrier, and format, can better match their intention to a product's design. When you speak to customers from this vantage point, you are not reciting chemistry for its own sake. You're giving them a map for why a jar that smells like terpinolene and eucalyptol lands differently than one anchored by nerolidol and bisabolol, even if the THC stamp is identical. You're explaining why a nanoemulsified gummy with 5 milligrams can feel decisive, while a conventional 10 milligrams oil in a hard candy drifts in and out. You're translating membrane physics, receptor trafficking, and ligand bias into the language of lived experience. And you're doing it without crossing into medical territory, because the claims you're making are about receptor behavior, delivery timing, and sensory context, not outcomes for conditions.